Okay, today we're going to be covering cases review and form development as part of the IM training series. This should be lesson 3. So today we're going to talk about how to deploy an ODK form to your Zeit project and look at a little bit of the relevant settings we have in Zeit for form deployment. We're also going to discuss briefly the case review page, understand what a case review is and how to set like case summary fields. And then we're also going to talk mostly about like helpful practices and useful features in ODK as it relates to Zeit Manager. And here are the chapters we are going to go through. So just to dive in, because we have a lot to cover, there are lots of resources about ODK forms and ODK, and here are just as a short list of resources we put together for you. We're not going to cover the basics of ODK forms or how to put together an initial form. Like there's really great guidance, there's really great lessons online for this. If you don't feel confident in your ability to set up an ODK form, these other resources are good places to start. There are like YouTube videos, there are online courses. Even the ODK website has like a basic getting started guide. Today, we're going to be covering a little bit more like advanced tips and tricks, let's say, that really make a difference when it comes to managing operations data. So we put this all here. This will also be shared to you in the e-learning, so you don't need to worry about getting these links later. So the first step in uploading a form to Zeit is to make sure your form validates. The validator that I like to use is on this URL address because it gives really clear error messages. You will also get an error message in Zeit if you upload like a incorrect form, and we can take a look at that in a moment. But I like this ODK version better because it sometimes gives more like robust error messages or tells you what row specifically the error is on. So that's a useful tool to have in your toolkit. And then generally speaking, uploading a form to Zeit has like 3 steps. First, you want to upload the form. Then you need to deploy that form to your project. And then you're going to optionally configure whatever other settings you need related to that form. We have like a range of different settings related to form deployment. So the first is that, we went over your site list last week and we went over things like site type and region. One of the first and obvious options we've made available is the ability to deploy certain forms by site type or just region. So maybe you have an activity that's, only active in the west of your response and you only want to make it to, sites in that location. Or for example, you have 2 types of sites. Maybe you have like an IDP site, but you also have a collective center, and certain activities are only done in the collective center. So in that case, you might make certain forms available by site type. And you can obviously update and change that whenever to customize how forms appear to users. We also have the ability to hide forms. We're not going to go into why you might want to use this. But basically, when a form is hidden, it doesn't mean that it can't be filled out. You can still import data into the form and do certain things with that. But it just kind of makes it invisible to users. So they can't start a case with that form. This is useful if you have forms in a process. So for example, if you have a form that should be filled out first, second, and then third, you may want to hide the second and third forms because they should kind of appear in relation to the first form. We're going to get into that in a later lesson more. The third option you have that is really useful is setting a display value and a summary fields. So on your site dashboard, you may have noticed, and we'll take a look again, that the titles of the submissions had different names associated with them. And that's because we set a display value where you can choose how the information on your site dashboard appears based on the values in the form. Summary fields are similarly going to allow you to customize just how that case information appears when you select it and do a case review. The last 2 options are setting a default status. So we have mandatory statuses that are assigned to all submissions. So you can choose whether when a form is submitted, does it come in as open? Does it come in as in progress or closed? So you can just choose the first status that is assigned to a form when a new submission has been made. Lastly, you can do things like schedule a form. Scheduling a form allows you, if you have a form that should be filled out every month, every week, every day, you can have the system automatically create a task for you. We haven't gone over tasks, but when we do later, it'll make sense. But this is basically a reminder to your users to fill out forms on a certain interval, like every week or every month. We also allow anonymous submission by QR codes. We're not going to, again, talk too much about this feature, but it is the case now that you don't necessarily need to have a username to submit forms in Zeit. And the way you would go about doing that is you would have a QR code available for the form and site, and people with access to the QR code or the associated link would be able to make submissions anonymously. This can be useful, if you wanted to put up a QR code in your collective center, for example, that says, provide us any relevant feedback. That's all made possible through this feature. The limitations are that it does require internet access because we're using the online version of Kobo, the Enketo system. So that is a constraint to this approach. But it does allow you to provide public-facing forms for people to submit data into your project space. Okay, so we're going to stop for a moment and look at how to do some of these basic steps that I just described. Okay, so here I am on my project space. I'm going to open the Forms tab, and you'll see that this is a list of my forms related to the Project IM training series. I am going to create a new form, and I'm going to just import it from my local. So I'm going to choose where the form is. So it should be in my demonstrations folder. And I'm going to try and upload a broken form. So this is the form that I know does not validate. So we can just look at that. Then you'll see that I've been given an error message here that's pretty clear. It's trying to find a reference that doesn't exist. So this is what it looks like when it fails. Obviously, I would have to fix this issue before proceeding. So I'm just going to proceed with the correct form or the correct version. Cool. So this means that my form has been uploaded, but I should be clear that this does not mean that the form is like active within my project. It just means the form is like available to deploy to different projects. So if you're a part of many projects, right, the first step is just uploading the form. The second step would then be choosing which projects you want to deploy that form to. So in order to deploy the form to my project, I go into my project settings. And if I go to my forms and I go to site forms, you'll see these are my deployed forms. So I've deployed 3 already, but I want to deploy another. So I'm going to go in here and click Assign New. I'm going to choose the form that I just deployed, my monitoring form. It's the only one I have available. And you'll see here these options that I talked about. So I can choose a default status. So for the monitoring form, generally speaking, after someone does a monitoring, we don't need to do anything else. I'm going to say closed. And you can see the advanced settings I was talking about. So regions and types, let's say we want the monitoring form for everything. And then you can also see that I can choose a display name. So I'm going to choose this field called description that I set up to describe the submission in a certain way. I don't want this submission hidden, and I'm not going to be using the scheduling settings. Okay, so my form is now deployed, and it's really as easy as that. The last thing you can do, as I mentioned, is set what are called summary fields. So if you go into the settings and you go summary fields, you'll see that I can choose fields that are kind of critical or important information in this form. Let's say I want the name, the phone, and the age of the person, and let's say gender. And then I want to see the notes associated with the form. And then maybe I want to see the top 3 needs. And you'll notice that I can kind of drag and drop and rearrange the order of questions. You're going to see what this does in a moment when we talk about case review, but generally speaking, it's always a good idea to pick some summary fields related to your form. Even if all the information is important, it's just like helpful if you're reviewing information or trying to check the basic information of a form. What is the critical information you might need to review or want to see first and foremost. Okay, that concludes the demo. Yeah, this stuff is pretty easy. So now we're going to talk about case summaries, reviews, and statuses. So here's some basic terminology that we're going to be using a lot throughout the kind of training series, and you're going to be using a lot when you use Zeit Manager. When we talk about a submission, we're talking about a single form uploaded to Zeit Manager. This is different than a case. So a case could be a single submission. It could be multiple submissions linked together. So sometimes, as I said, you may have 3 forms related to a single case. And that's if you have like a multi-step process that you're running in Zeit. So you can, as I said, you can have every submission will be part of a case, but cases might be made up of multiple submissions. The first submission that you make, so if you just like open a form and submit it into Zeit, it will be given a case ID and a unique unique ID. Case ID is the primary key for cases within Zeit Manager. It is the best way to communicate about cases. We really strongly recommend that it becomes sort of a team practice for you to not, say, oh, there was a referral last week related to WASH. It's much better to say, here is the case ID of the referral that I'm working on, because that's a much quicker and faster way of searching for that information and finding what you're looking for. Case description is the value that I selected, and it's basically a value from the form itself that will be used to represent the form on the Zeit dashboard. You can pick any field in your form, but generally speaking, we're going to recommend that you sort of make a value that you think is a good way to represent the form and summarize the information within. And then a case summary, as I said, is a set of fields that will appear at the top of the case review section. So, forms can be very long. They can be hundreds of questions. And at the end of the day, you may actually be looking for, 10 pieces of information over and over again. So case summaries are a way for us to say, hey, what is the most critical information related to the case that you want to make easily available to reviewers and users? Okay, associated with cases, we have, just like we have site information fields, we have case information fields. Some of them are mandatory fields that are just added automatically. So this includes the case ID and the form name that will be like available within the system always. We also have the comment, which is an optional text field. And it's a bit of a tricky one because you can obviously add multiple comments to cases. So you might have 3 or 4 comments related to a case, depending on how much work has been done on it. However, you can only have one status. So a case at any given moment is always going to have one status value. It will have a history of maybe having had multiple statuses, but at any given time, it's going to have like a current status value. That's a single select question, and we have 5 statuses to choose from. We're going to cover a little bit about the meaning of the statuses at a later lesson. There's also a reason field, which is again a single select option. Reason is kind of like a strange word to use maybe, but you can think of it as a little bit of the result of the case. You're not going to use this necessarily for all your processes, but for those of you who've been managing referrals in Zeit Manager, know that we often use reason to represent whether a case was resolved or unresolved or approved or not approved. So for example, something might be closed, but that doesn't tell us whether the intended action was taken or what was the outcome of that decision, right? So this is why you have different fields for status and reason. You're also optionally allowed to upload attachments for cases. You can turn this on and off if you don't need it. And lastly, you have the ability to add tags. We're going to talk about this more later, but tags are useful for often filtering and sorting your submissions. So for example, if you have 100 referrals, you may want to use cluster as a tag as a way to say which of those referrals are related to WASH or Shelter NFI, for example. And then last but not least, you can add any other information you need to your cases. So for example, if you needed to know the date of the approval, or you needed to know, who was the assigned agency to resolve a certain issue, you can add a field called date of approval. That's a date field, or you can add like organization and give a list of organizations that you want the users to select. So really, again, with Zeit, we're allowing you to really customize what information gets associated with your case. With all of these fields, it should be noted that this information is edited through the case review panel, which is only available through the web-based client, not the mobile application. Okay, so a case review basically means anytime you open a submission page and you do one of the following things. So you would change the status, add a comment, select a reason, or adjust a custom field. This is different than editing a case. So if you edit a case, which we'll show you in a moment, that doesn't count as a review. That counts as an edit. So if you hear us use these things saying review a case or edit a case, this is really what we're referring to. It's not necessarily one of these actions. It's one of these actions, but it could be any one of them. Okay, and with editing cases, one of the great or best features of Zeit, I think, is that cases can be edited after they are submitted, and everything is kind of corrected in the record. So the benefits of this are oftentimes, right, we may have mistakes in the form, or users make mistake in submitting information. And if they have the right user permissions, they need to be assigned as an editor, they can actually go in and correct the record. So this is, again, one of the kind of, I would say, key features in terms of managing and cleaning your data. It also allows you as an IM to say, hey, this user incorrectly edited these 20 cases. Rather than me correcting their work, they're going to correct it themselves. And often it's when people have to kind of fix their own mistakes that they start to, let's say, attend more carefully to their work and to how they're submitting data into a system. So really, even if you can help people, sometimes it's best practice to actually encourage them to fix their own mistakes, because it's the best way to make sure they avoid repeating them in the future. We can also do things like deleting a case. This is only available to project managers. It's just a note that it can't be undone, and it does require you to confirm your deletion. So you will have to type delete in capital letters into a box. Yeah, and we do not want you deleting things in bulk. If that's ever needed, you can contact us. This is just to, again, really avoid accidental deletion of data. Lastly, on the case review page, you have things like a case history and a version history, which just shows you what has happened on the case over time, what date it happened, who did it, and what was done. The version history is for tracking multiple versions of an edited submission. So, you might have version 1, which was how it was submitted, and version 2, which was a correction or an edit that was made. Okay, so let's take a look at this in Zeit. I think it becomes much clearer once we open the web application. Okay, so here I am on my site dashboard. You'll see here that I have different text. These are actually slightly different forms. So I believe these bottom 3 are activity reporting forms. This top one is a referral form. And as you can see, they're not called referral form. They're actually giving some custom label. This label is actually generated in the form itself. It is the description field that I selected for this form. So as I said, you can customize how these forms appear in your dashboard to make it easier to navigate. For this one that we're going to open, you'll see that I have my case summary information. So these are the fields that I selected on the case summary page. This is what I would consider like the critical information related to this form. It's the date of the referral, the cluster it's related to, and just the description. So this is a referral for a water filter repair and maintenance. And it's for the entire site. Obviously, there's more information associated with the actual submission itself that I can look at, including my contact information and things. We can edit the form, as I said. So to edit the form, we simply can click edit. It will open the Enketo browser. I can change options here. For example, I can change this to toilet repair, and then we can resubmit as required. Cool. So this is going to reload the page, and you'll notice that initially it says water filter repair. It may take a moment to actually reload the edit that you have. So don't panic. As you see, I hit refresh, and you'll see now it says toilet repair and upgrade. On the right is what we call the review panel. So you'll see here I can change the status. I can add a comment, attach a file, add a tag, and select a reason. So this is all the basic information. If I added custom fields, they would also appear here below. I can review the history of this case. So you can see I did a bit of work before the lesson began. I changed the status to in progress. I added a comment, and you can see the edit here is also recorded on my version tab. You can now see 2 forms. If I do need to go into the original form, I can click this and it will open the original form that shows that actually it was the water filter repair question that was changed. So yeah, this is the basics of, let's say, case review. You'll see here that I can delete this submission as well. I'm not going to do that. I can also download a PDF version of this submission if that's something that I need. Maybe I need to take this submission to a meeting to discuss with my manager. And you can see some of the metadata here as well related to the site. Okay, so that covers case review. This is something you're probably not going to be doing a lot as an IM. Generally speaking, you're not necessarily the ones making submissions and managing them. This is probably something that your field teams will be doing much more often than you are. Okay, so we've put together 3 case studies for this training, and these are the case studies that we're going to return to in later lessons. So I wanted to spend some time talking about these case studies, what we're doing in each of them, and a little bit how they work, what their objectives are. So the 3 that we've put together for you are an activity reporting form, and this is really going to be for us to track our indicators related to a range of activities that our program might be doing. The second is a referral system. And the objective of that is really the management and sharing of data related to referrals. And the third is a site monitoring form that's used for monitoring sites over a period of time. I think these are pretty common uses, which is why we picked them. And we've intentionally not set up the forms or the processes based on our kind of core activities that we often suggest to you as site manager. We've stripped them down. We've tried to make them a bit simpler so that they're sort of easy to understand the functionality related to them. In reality, your actual forms and processes are probably going to be more complicated, unfortunately. Okay, so the first is an activity report. Really, our objective here is to record information about activities by field staff. So this is for reporting purposes. We're not trying to really do like the management of the actual activities or the planning of the activities. We're just saying when an activity has been done, and the information there should really match what we need to report, maybe to our donors or in a 4W. The structure of this is that we want to have one form completed after each activity. So rather than having a form that tracks data across many activities, we've decided to make it one form for one activity. And we're going to talk a little bit why that is later. In this, though, it's always a good idea to think like, what does one form represent in this process? And for us, this one form represents an activity that was performed by a field staff on a date. Okay, the second case, site monitoring, is really to monitor information about sites based on inputs we get from a site focal. So this is generally like profile information about your site. So no matter what your site type, you might imagine some information, whether it's capacity or population or date of construction. There's always sort of this additional information, and we can add that to the site profile, but it's often more helpful to have a form that has maybe more information and is an easier way to fill out that information for users. The structure for this is obviously one form is going to represent one monitoring visit. So one row is one visit and one monitoring to a site. And we're going to use this primarily for our site profiles. So we want to be able to say, a little bit about each of the sites we work in and be able, let's say, to produce for donors, for field visits, for sharing, for advocacy, information about those sites. Okay, the last case we're going to be dealing with is a referral system. This is, again, designed much more for the actual management of information. So this is different than reporting. We're not just trying to report the referrals we've done. We're trying to use Zeit to manage the information related to referrals. So that includes sharing with designated focal points. That also includes like tracking, whether the referral is still open or closed. We might be using this to also monitor quality of services or whether teams are working together would also be kind of a sub-objective, we can say. The data structure is that one form is going to represent one referral. And that's really important. Why have we done that? I mean, we'll get into it later, but again, many times people are trying to track multiple referrals in one form. So they have like a WASH referral, shelter referral, NFI referral, all done in one form. Things get really confusing really fast, though, if you think that, that one form then needs to be shared maybe with 3 different focal points, will have 3 different outcomes, and also 3 different statuses. So that's often why you'll see us in Zeit, breaking things up and really trying to think about having one form represent like one unit of work or one distinct process so that it's much easier to manage that data. It's much easier to work with. The output of this is obviously just the referrals as certain work gets done and initiated between units or between organizations. And we might also be doing, some analysis or some work like a quarterly referral summary off of this system. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a bit and we're going to use those use cases to talk about kind of best practices within Open Data Kit. As I said, we are not going to be going over the basics. We're going to be covering kind of a lot of, let's say, more advanced guidance. So if you feel a bit lost, don't worry. You may just need to go and really cover some of the basics before you start getting to the kind of details of what we're talking about. And I would even say that if you're not able to follow everything, don't worry. It is still very common for myself, for Harris, to go onto the ODK guidance website and look at the guidance related to some of the functionality that we're telling you, because it's a lot and it's really easy to forget parts of it. So the first thing to know about Zeit is that Zeit will attach some default fields for all of your forms. So we're going to talk about those. And we're also going to talk about how fields are referenced in Zeit. Now, this is something that if you've been working in ODK before, maybe you didn't think too much about. But it is more important when you start working with ODK and Zeit Manager, namely because it can cause some problems. So this is really what we're going to cover in this chapter. So things you don't need to add to your forms anymore are things like the site ID and name. So many times people would have a form that says like, where are you doing this activity? What is the site name? Because the user selects the site before they open the form, we already know what site they're in when they submit a form. So that's kind of the benefit, is that this comes no matter what form they filled out, we know the site and the name, and we don't need to put this in the form itself. When we export the data, Zeit is always going to be able to provide us the site ID and name. Similarly, we also know what user is submitting the form. So things like user ID, user profile information, and name, that's also going to come with the form if you want it to. Things like date of submission is, again, a meta field. Now, this is to note that date of submission may be different than the form date. And this is because if you were offline and you filled out a form on Monday, but you didn't upload the form until Friday, Zeit will mark the submission date as Friday, but you may have done the form on Monday. So submission date comes as default, but just keep in mind it may not actually be the date the work was actually done, depending on how often you sync your project. Lastly, we have form location as an available meta field. You don't have to take all these fields, just to note, but they are available. You don't need to add them in the form. So some of you may have used the audit function in ODK, which tracks things like how long users spent on various questions. It also tracks the location. Form location is collected by the application when the form is opened. And this is allowing us to do a little bit of remote management. If we've sent people to specific locations and asked them to do assessments, the form metadata is helpful for that. It's also kind of sometimes helpful in debugging when geocoordinate recording isn't working so well. So sometimes accuracy in remote locations is not always working well. So it gives us another data point to work with when we look at where users were. Finally, you can get other information. This is just kind of more of a side note. You get things like the case URL. So that would be like the URL of the case related to Zeit. You can also get other information related to your sites and your users. But generally speaking, don't add questions that say, what is the username of the person filling the form, or what site are you at? Zeit is going to give that to you automatically. You don't need to add it anymore. Okay, we're also going to talk about referencing of fields, and this is going to be probably one of the trickier things for your work in Zeit. I mean, it's pretty easy to understand, but it's always something that ends up causing problems or creating mistakes for us when we do our work. So Zeit in ODK, we reference fields with this $ curly brackets. So for example, if I have a field in my form, like my below form has these two questions, age and gender, age would be referenced in ODK with the $ curly brackets. So that means in the form, I'm referring to the age field. If I'm on the same line, you'll also see sometimes a period being used. So in this case, if I say selected brackets period apostrophe male, that means if this field has male selected. So yeah, it's either always in the ODK form going to be a period, or this $ curly brackets period refers to the current field. However, when we work outside of the form, because keep in mind that Zeit is, independent from ODK in a sense. So when Zeit engages in form data or is trying to do things with your form, so whether that's exporting data from your form, editing data in your form, whether that is setting like display fields or values or summary fields, it is going to be looking for something called demographic/age. So, and this is a part of the structure of ODK that technically the address for the age question for ODK and for Zeit as an extension is going to be demographic/age or demographic/gender. So grouping, even though we might think of that field as just being called age, in kind of programming language, the form structure is really looking at it in a specific address, which includes the group as a prefix. So demographic/, as if we're kind of keying into a directory or a folder almost. Similarly, choices are a bit easier to understand. We also have a name and a label. And names are really, again, how ODK understands what choice is selected. And this is a product of ODK working across multiple languages. So, right, you might have like an English label and a French label and a German label. At the end of the day, the program understands these options as 1, 2, and 3, right? Really, we can put any values there. We can put chicken, duck, and egg. It doesn't really matter. Whatever you put in the name field is how it actually understands what label is selected. When you export the data, you can choose, right, do I want to export it as English or French? Underneath everything, the system is just really recording whether you've selected 1, 2, or 3 in the name field. So, for example, in our select one question of gender, if we wanted to assign male, the ODK is actually storing demographic/gender as 1 as the value. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that groups start to, let's say, affect how we might work with the form or reference data, especially in other parts. And it's just to note that I think a lot of people often use groups for various purposes, but not necessarily thinking about the impact they may have on addressing. So we're going to cover some like basic do's and don'ts. It's a great idea to use groups when you want to use functionality associated with groups. So this includes things like the field list appearance. What that does, that makes all of the questions in a group appear on one screen for the user. So rather than having to swipe right for those two questions of age and gender would appear on one screen and they scroll up and down the screen as opposed to left and right. Another reason is that if you have like lots of relevance, so if you say these questions should only appear when this other value is selected, you don't necessarily want to apply that to every question in the group. You can apply that to the group itself, and then all the children of the group, the questions in the group meaning, are going to have the same logic applied to it. And the last reason is more like sort of aesthetic. If you have bigger forms, like if your form is 60 questions, groups are useful in understanding, okay, which of these questions are related to wash or which of these questions are related to shelter. That's also a valid usage. But we're saying this just because avoid creating many groups, I would say. So avoid creating groups with single questions or only 2 questions. Definitely avoid groups within groups. And definitely avoid having just like an excessive number of groups. It's always better to try and combine thematically thinking like, what are these 15 questions doing? Are they optional questions? Are they questions related to a particular topic? And the reason is this, is that the more groups we add, the more complicated we make our address system, right? So if I have groups within groups, you can still reference those fields, but it starts to become, demographic / personal information / age of person. Like this starts to get harder and harder to reference that data. I mean, Zeit will have no problem with it, but some of the things you do later on in Zeit will become harder as a result. Other things to note are just that there's no like magical way to change the address of a field. Once you've deployed a form, so if we deployed that form earlier with age and gender, the information for age is stored in demographic / age. If I change that form and I remove the group, so I just then have age and gender, Zeit is sort of going to read that as a new question. It's not going to understand that you moved the age field just outside the group, because it's still going to be looking for the original data in demographic/age. It's not going to find it. And so it's just going to think that even though the name is the same, age, the address is actually different. And so this is why it's important when you're making form amendments, when you're updating information, you have to be really aware when you're changing a field name, because that's also adjusted. If we change from age to, I don't know, say age range, that would be kind of also breaking the address. Similarly, if we remove the field, obviously it's not going to find it. And the last is also changing data type is technically kind of a change of address, because it's not just looking for demographic/age, it's looking for a number in demographic/age. So if we change that to like a select one age range, like a child, an adult, an elderly person, that's also probably going to break your data connection. It's not going to mean that your new form won't work. Your new form will work. You just may lose access to some of that older data. It will appear in certain parts of the system, but like during exporting of your data, you'll probably start to run into challenges. Okay, so we're going to now talk about how to improve the quality of data that you get when you kind of manage ODK forms in Zeit. And the kind of, we're going to cover some general guidance. And I think what I'm going to really try and impress upon you is to stop thinking of ODK as a form builder and start thinking about it as really like a programmable interface. And this is really the power of ODK, is that ODK has expanded its functionality to the extent that I no longer think it's fair to just think of it as like a form builder. It gives you such a wide range of options for customizing, for calculating, for displaying certain things, that really it's not just like, hey, it's Google Forms, you have 5 choice of questions, they always look the same way. You have so much freedom and flexibility over how you work in a form that really you can think of it almost as if you're like programming an application, even though a form is maybe a very simple version of an application. In this, we're also going to talk about going long and not wide and what that means, and also just how to avoid this problem of having garbage data in your processes, which is, I think, probably the largest, most important thing you could do in improving your work as an IM and your project overall. And then lastly, we're going to talk about, let's say, more aesthetic stuff that still definitely matters. And it's kind of really how to improve the user experience for people who are filling out forms. Cool. So the general guidance that we're going to give you is, when you design a form or you design a process, try not to mix objectives or requirements. It is much better to have multiple forms with really clear purposes than having like what we call everything forms, or forms with multiple purposes, right? So it may be that our referral record is also sort of tracking how many referrals we've done, but we're not also trying to like, do the other activity tracking in the referral form, or vice versa. Yeah, ODK will allow you to do this, right? You can add as many questions as you want to an ODK form. You can make forms as complicated as you want, but often there's a beauty and simplicity, and having a process that does one thing, not many things, is much better than having like an everything process. It's going to be much easier for you to change in the future, to manage. It's also much easier to train users to do, because you can train them incrementally. You can also break up work, right? So if people are really only doing focus group discussions and reporting those, they only really need to know that one form, and maybe we have other people doing referrals, and then maybe they only need to learn that form. So it's going to give you just a lot more granularity in how you manage your teams, coordinate work, manage your data. It really is key, I would say, to success. Other general guidance that we're not going to do too much is just test and review your forms before you scale up. This is often skipped. I cannot tell you how many times I have skipped this step and later come to regret it. It is the worst experience, getting a message from your field team saying the form is not working. Like this value doesn't enter, or there's some other issue with a constraint. It is really, really, really key. If you like, and I know we're all working in an emergency setting, we often get pressed to push out work very rapidly. Even if you can do an office test, even if you can put it in the hands of someone other than you, I think it's often really helpful to have someone that is not the person who designed the form test the form. I mean, obviously you should do your own testing and checking, But a fresh set of eyes who is less familiar with the form is really going to be best in making sure something works correctly. I would say even if you have to roll something out the door, if you have like, let's say, a big monitoring exercise, even if you can just get 2 or 3 team members doing the form a day before everyone else, before you scale up, that's going to save you a lot of headache and a lot of pain. This goes double if you're working in offline or limited bandwidth environments, just because obviously people can't just resync and get a form update easily. Last advice here is this old phrase, garbage in, garbage out. Working more on your forms is going to save you hours of cleaning. So it is much, much better to invest in making good forms than spend time cleaning the garbage that came into poorly designed forms. And we're going to try and show you how far you can go in working on a form, because I see a lot of great forms that have been developed in the humanitarian space, but generally speaking, a lot of them could use just more work, more things added to them. Even if the form is working fine, there's a lot that can always be done, I would say, to improve and streamline work. Going long and not wide. So this is the idea that more rows is better than more fields. So if you were given the choice of managing, 1,000 rows or 100 fields with 10 rows, managing 100 fields is much harder. And the reason for that is that, fields have a much more finicky structure, right? As we said, we can't necessarily change their addresses. They have data types associated with them. It's also just hard to view your data. And if you're doing any sort of analysis or processing of your data, every time you add a field, you're generally going to be adding steps to your process that you need to manage. So as much as possible, think about how can you have structures that kind of fulfill this idea that you're going to have more rows at the end of the day as opposed to more fields. So that example I gave you earlier about, you could have a process that allows the user to do 3 referrals in one form versus 1. You can do that, but it's going to mean that you have more fields, more complexity, more confusion, or they fill out 3 forms, they're shorter forms, it's going to be the same amount of time, but your data is longer, not wider. And that, again, makes a lot of things much easier to manage for you later down the line. Try and always make sure you have a single source of data. This goes within a form, but also across forms. So if you're going to be tracking site population, for example, don't have a monitoring form and let's say a population update form and then population data in the site information that you've manually added. That will make things very confusing to you. And also, at the end of the day, what it's going to do is you're going to have multiple conflicting sources of data, and you're not going to know really which one you should use or trust. So in general, try and think about this idea of having one source, meaning, one question, one field for a specific type of information. Or if you do need to have like duplicates, make it clear how they're different. So is this the population information from the cluster versus the population information we've collected from the site, for example, and labeling that clearly. Use choice filters liberally. A lot of times in my review of forms developed in country responses, we see people using like a skip logic. So if there's a follow-up question, they will more often use 2 fields instead of just having 1 field with a choice filter. You can really do a lot with choice filters, and we're going to look at that a bit later. But choice filters, great feature, and it again helps you reduce the number of fields you have. Last but not least, there's this trick of summarizing fields out of multiple questions. We're going to go over that later in this lesson, but basically you can pull multiple values together into one field. So even when you have to have 3 or 4 different fields to cover your cases, you can always pull that information back into one field if it's more useful. Okay, so the first step in garbage in, garbage out is avoiding garbage in. And the way we do that primarily is through constraints. Constraints are, basically you saying you can only enter things a certain way. And ODK is great in that it allows you to apply so many different sets of logic to this. So we're going to go through how you can constrain literally almost every type of question. And I would encourage you, if you have forms that you're working with, you can look at them and ask yourself, am I constraining for options that shouldn't be entered? So in the idea of constraining everything, let's go through them. For select one and select multiple, just keep in mind, select one is kind of already a constraint, right? You're giving users, one from a set of options. I would say select one is one in which you probably don't need to implement too many constraints. That said, select multiple often does get quite tricky. Often you'll see, what are your favorite fruits is the question, and it's apple, pear, peaches. And then maybe the fourth option is none of the above. You should obviously not be selecting none of the above and the other. And there are ways to really avoid select multiple data structures, because keep in mind, whenever you have a select multiple data field, you're getting the data of apple, pear, and peaches all in one cell and comma segregated. And that can be hard to work with. It can be hard to analyze. Sometimes it's much better to take an approach that says, does the person like apples? Yes, no. Does the person like peaches? Yes, no. That can be more onerous depending on what you're doing, but sometimes it's more appropriate and better just to avoid using select multiple and have kind of select one questions and dedicated fields for the values that they hold. Similarly, anytime you use an integer question, you should always implement a minimum and a maximum. And this sounds a bit strange because you're like, well, why would I need a minimum? You can actually enter in negative numbers into ODK in an integer value. So, if it's someone age, obviously age should never be negative. Also, if it's someone age, people generally are not above the age of 100. I mean, maybe there are times when that happens, but it's very often the case that people will, what I call fat fingering, which is, they're entering in a number on the keypad and they'll add an extra number at the end just by mistake. So you can constrain like how many digits should be there using this function called string length, which means that like it's basically if you say string length equals 2, it means that it should only be 2 digits. So that could be 99 or 1, but it can't be 101 or anything with 3 digits in it. You can also do the traditional, must be less than 100 or less than or equal to. That also works fine. Regular expressions. You may be surprised to know that ODK supports regular expressions. If you don't know what a regular expression is, it's sometimes called a regex. And they're basically a very complicated pattern matching syntax. What do I mean by that? So, I think we all know what like an email address looks like, right? We know that it has some amount of text or numbers or even symbols sometimes with an @ symbol, and then some address, a domain, and then a period, and then some ending, right? It could be a .com or a .co.uk. IOM is .iom.int, right? Or at iom.int. So, we know what that looks like. And a regex is basically a way in which you can have your software or code scan to see if an input matches a pattern, right? So it matching kind of that pattern of at iom.int. It's a very common actually like a software method that you'll see like if you know other programming languages, you'll find regular expressions there. There's a lot of help on regex patterns, and we're not going to talk about how to design a pattern in ODK. To use regex, you simply type regex, and then in brackets you write the field, comma, and then in single quotation marks, the pattern that you're searching for. Regex patterns, I will say, are very complicated. And I don't remember all of the syntax off my head. The great thing I've discovered in the last year, because every time I do them, I need to review the guidance, I find that AI is really great. So this regex pattern above was given to me by AI, and I told, I believe, Claude, hey, give me an ODK regex pattern for email addresses. And what this is doing is it's allowing users to enter in, some amount of capital, lowercase letters, digits, symbols that are approved with the @ sign, and then kind of the suffix that matches. So you should be using regex patterns and constraints for things like emails, phone numbers, ID fields. Keep in mind, phone numbers are not numbers. They should be treated as text because they can start with 0. And yeah, people write phone numbers in different ways. You can write plus, 1 if you're referring to a phone number in America. You can also write 001. So this is always why it's a good idea to implement regex for these sort of alphanumeric fields, text fields that have very specific patterns that should match. So these are my 3 use cases. Anytime you're going to ask users for IDs, emails, or phones, implement a regex. Less common constraints. So everything else is also constrainable. For example, if you're asking for a geopoint, you can set a constraint to make sure that they're recording it to a certain accuracy, which is very helpful. You can also set date constraints. This is one that I often see people skipping, but right, if you're saying, when did the person arrive in the site and you don't implement a constraint, they could put that arrival date in the future, and sometimes that does happen. So you can simply say, yeah, the date must be before today or sometime in the past. Also, just to note that you can change the appearance of date questions so that you're not asking for specific dates. You can ask for month dates. That's also very useful sometimes in avoiding garbage data, because a lot of times people, if they don't know the exact date, they're just going to pick a number because they have to fill out the form, and that can cause problems. So if you're going to ask questions like, when did you arrive here? I probably couldn't tell you the exact date, but I might be able to tell you the month and the year, for example. Select multiple, just to note, you can also use like count selected logic. So if you say, what are your 3 favorite fruits? You don't want people picking 4 values. You can use count selected to constrain that. You can also do things like you can't, select none and something else, which is definitely one you should be using if you're using that sort of approach of choose the options of the list, none of the above. Use something like that. Okay, and the last thing we were going to cover this chapter is thinking about user experience when we fill out a form. And I mentioned that you can start to think about ODK as a programmable user interface. It is a user interface that you are in charge of programming and presenting. Obviously, a lot of the work has been done for you in terms of ODK, actually representing how things should look based on inputs. One of the first things you should do when you design a form is really ask yourself, after you've drafted it, how can I enter garbage into this form? Assume the user wants to break your form. Now, users are generally not trying to do this. They're just trying to do their jobs, but it helps to think of a malicious user who is intentionally trying to put junk data into your form. This is the right mindset to have when you are testing. This is the right mindset to have when you are designing, just because it's going to make you very defensive in terms of how you program and set up your form. So how can you do this? One way is, which is kind of more suggestive and friendly, is just to use hints and instructions. I often see these skips. Like if you're going to ask for ID information and the ID is 3 letters followed by hyphen followed by numbers, sometimes people write IDs without hyphens, or sometimes they include them. It's really helpful to say like, hey, I'm asking for this ID. The ID should appear as number, hyphen, letter, or whatever the format is in the hint, so that they understand. Oftentimes you can put in a question type note, which is just like a note that appears to the user, where you can say, hey, this is how you should fill out questions in the following section. Like you should read off the options of the question, or you should not read off the options, and you should only mark what has been said by the respondent. Include this stuff. It really removes a lot of confusion. I think in operations data, one of the things we forget is that while we do trainings, we often don't do trainings as often as people rotate. We always have people, as projects change, as people come and go. If you have like 100 users or even 50 users, it's not going to be the case that everyone has been trained on that particular form. A lot of times people are learning forms as they do them. So this is why definitely include, instructions, information liberally when you design your form. You can also do things like prompt users to review the information they inputted, right? So if you ask me to put in someone's name, age, ID number, phone number, it is likely the case that I may make a mistake. And so what you can do is, after people have entered in the information, show them what they've entered on one screen at the end. We're going to look at an example of this just to really make sure that like, hey, did you get this right? Is this correct? You can even force them to confirm like, yes, no, that something's correct. This is really important for key information that you want to get right. So for example, if you're asking someone to record the population of a site, and then you're going to ask them like, how many households are there? Something you can do can say like, okay, so you've said that there are 1,000 people in this site. That means that if there are 5 people per household, there should be 200 households in this site. How many households are there? if you design your form this way, it sort of helps people understand what a valid answer might be. So they're not just like going through question by question, kind of writing down mindlessly, or just making, entry errors carelessly. Like this happens a lot when we're under pressure and we have a lot of work to do. So some of the ways you can help users as well is with things like appearances. So if you don't know about quick, autocomplete, or field lists, take a look at these. These are actually like, you will not see the difference on Enketo, like the web version of ODK. You'll see this more in the mobile app. They really do change like how quickly or slowly people can move through forms, depending on, what you're doing. We're not going to cover too much of it. One of them I will talk more about is the search appearance. So if you have long choice lists, like you need to know what region the person came from in the country, and there are, 70 districts, put a search appearance. It's going to allow the people to search for the actual district name instead of having to scroll through a list of 70 options. Similarly, you can keep in mind, you can reference fields in labels. So in the label text itself, if you write $, curly brackets, and give the field name, that will allow the person to see what was entered previously. So for example, if you're recording demographic information of multiple people in the household, and the first question is name, and then you want to know that person's age, you can say, what is, brackets, name, age, right? And what that will actually show the user is what is Danny's age, right? As opposed to like just the reference value itself. So this is kind of, again, more advanced, but allowing you really to make sure people understand what information is needed. In this case, like the name of the person they're supposed to enter the age for. Similarly, you can also do things like bold values, which is helpful. So to do that, you do things like ** around your labels. This may not appear in the web version, but definitely works in the phone. And lastly, just to know that you can upload images. And sometimes this is useful. So for example, we use this a lot for IDs. Like IDs will often have like multiple numbers on them. And if you're asking for a specific number or a specific barcode, you can upload an image of like a dummy ID and say, this is the barcode, or this is the name of the person we want you to record. Okay, what is a summary section? You'll see this a lot in our core activity forms. And basically a summary section is usually at the end of the form. It can be, anywhere in the form that you feel is needed. And what is it? It basically is there to show the user key information. So the way we do this is we usually create a group, often called summary. We give it the appearance field list. What that does is it makes all the questions appear on one screen. And you'll see here, we've done this ***, name, : ***. That means name will appear in bold. And then the $, curly brackets, name will show the name that was entered in the name field, right? And what this is doing is like, if you're making a referral for someone, at the end of the form, it's going to say like, hey, did you enter their name and phone number correctly? Because that's maybe key information we need to make the referral and also to follow up with the person. So this doesn't have any functional purpose. Like you're not going to, notes don't store data. Like actually nothing is being done in these 4 fields, but they're still really useful, right? Because they're helping the user understand what's been done, and they're giving them a way before they submit to just check everything, that they have everything right. That's much preferred to them, like swiping through, 20 questions to see if they did something correctly. Cool. So we're going to take a look at some of our forms and just show you the forms themselves a little bit, some good tips and tricks in forms. And then we're going to be sending these forms to you after the lesson and also uploading them to the e-learning so that you can take a look at them yourself. Cool. So this is my monitoring form, and I'm going to show you just a few things that I think are useful practices. One is that you'll notice that this form is formatted as a table. And it has formatting. That doesn't cause any problems for ODK. You can add as much formatting as you want. It's still going to validate correctly, which is a great feature. And what it means is that it's much easier for me, if you notice, to like read and program this form, right? Because I've frozen the view so that I always have the name of the field, in the view that I'm working on, even if I'm, let's say, all the way over here working on constraints. And I also just have the, what column I'm in. So really basic tricks to help you Another thing I do is that I color my groups. This just allows me to understand what groups I've put values in. This is again really helpful because keeping in mind that groups are important when you start referencing data in the future or when you make amendments, that if I was to move this phone question down here, that's again going to break the address. I'm going to lose some of my old data, not lose it, but the connection will no longer be there. So yeah, really basic things. They don't take long, but if you'll notice, they really improve the readability for me of the form. None of this is mandatory. I think everyone has their own style. So maybe you want to do bolding or have different size text, whatever works for you. It's just to note that like doing little things like this generally helps like your own management of data and forms, right? Cool. So if you'll see at the end, we're going to look at the two things. We're going to look at the summary section. So here, this is my monitoring form, and you'll notice that I've just made a summary group. I've showed who was interviewed, the population of the site, number of households, and latrines, and because I want to know a little bit of information about the latrines. So that's all I need to make a review field. And basically, this is just going to appear as one block on the user's mobile phone at the end of the form, just so they can check that they've gotten everything right. Calculate fields don't display. We'll be talking about that in a minute. And then lastly, you can see I have my description field here. So my description for monitoring forms is just the purpose field, which should say whether it's an assessment or a monitoring exercise, and then the form date. So it'll say like assessment hyphen January 23rd, for example. And I've even formatted the date a bit. So rather than showing just like the numerical date, I'm using the month name. So it should say like JAN, the 3-letter abbreviation for the date. So again, ODK really allowing you to customize how things appear, making things more readable for yourself, for your users. It's a really great tool in that way. So we're not going to go through all the constraints and the hints in this. You'll see that information is here, so you can look at how some of it's been done. And we tried to use examples from this lesson and more examples even than we've covered for you to understand and play around with a bit. So this is the last section. I apologize, this lesson is been longer and harder to get through. So we're going to talk a little bit about pre-processing our data and what this means. So what we mean by pre-processing data is making sure the data is in the structure we want when it is submitted. And we're going to cover like, why would you do this? We all know that like you can take data, you can export it, and then you can process it. You can transform it, merge things together, separate things, analyze it however you want. But there's a reason why doing this in the form is going to save you a lot of time and be like a better or more accurate way than asking users to do something or trying to apply a process later on. How we do this is really this idea of working backwards to success. So it means we're going to start at the end and think about what that means for the design of our forms and how we might achieve certain things. So we're going to cover some kind of basic examples of working backwards. So the first step would be by making an imaginary data output from your form. Like, how do you want the data to look? Like, what is your ideal version of it? And then think about, is this really like all the information you need? Is the information structured in a friendly and easy to use way? And is there something you can do to like make you have fewer fields or to make the data easier to work with? And this is something you should really do before you even start building your form. So our recommendation is that you actually just sit and you make an imaginary table. I mean, as I said, you don't need to spend like hours doing this. Even if you just spend 20 minutes saying, this is how I want my data to be at the end of the day, and then start from there in design, you're really going to have a lot more success in building forms that are better for you to work with. The main way you do this is through calculated fields. So we're going to talk about calculated fields, and then we're going to cover a practical example of this. So calculated fields are basically fields that don't appear to the user. So if the field has a value calculate, the user does not see it. And a calculate is basically asking the ODK form to do some amount of like processing of data, whether that's simple arithmetic or like some work with text. It's actually super flexible and allows you to do a bunch of different things. So the first and most obvious one is working with numbers, right? If I've asked for men, women, boys, and girls, I can then, in separate questions, I can then use a calculated field to add all of them together. Other things I can do are things like calculate time periods. So I want to know, the person arrived in January, today it's March. I want to know how many days between January and March, like that the person's been here. So rather than asking like, how many days have you been here? I can actually automatically calculate that. I can say, what was their date of birth? And then I can calculate their age from the date of birth as opposed to asking them. This is, again, a way in which you can make it faster to fill out a form because you're not asking the user to do all this information for you. You shouldn't really be asking the user to do math, in my opinion, because ODK is going to do math much more reliably than a user is while they're giving a survey. Other things you can do are converting units. So for example, if let's say people are really much more comfortable working in pounds instead of kilograms, but at the end of the day, you need kilograms for whatever work you're doing, you can have that conversion built into the form so that you don't need to convert it later. Yeah, and then lastly, sometimes when you're working with like arithmetic, if the field has no value, so if the value is null, it will give you a calculation error. It doesn't know how to work with null values. So you can use this coalesce function to just basically say, if the field has no value, use 0 or use whatever number you want them to use by default. You can look at the guidance for how coalesce works. It's pretty simple syntax. Okay, calculate fields, though, as I said, they're not just for numbers and that sort of like arithmetic kind of style calculations. They're also great for text and text processing. So we use them for description fields. And what do I mean by a description field? As I said, it's used to describe a form, and then we can use that field, the description field, to represent the form on the site dashboard. So we can, rather than just say, this is a referral, it can say, this is a WASH referral from this date, or it's a WASH referral for Danny Coyle, whatever is easiest for your users when they're on their site dashboard managing data. They're created by you. So Zeit is not going to create you a description field. You can pick like an existing question in your form. Like you could always pick what the referral is. So it could just say WASH, but usually we probably want it to have like a few pieces of information. So below you can see for each of our use cases, I made description fields, and you'll notice that they don't look super pretty, like in terms of the code, but the output is actually quite useful. So for our activity form, we're going to have the name of the activity that was done, followed by how many things were achieved, how many people were there, or how much of something was done, and then the date it was done on. Again, that information is sort of included a little bit in the metadata and also in the form data, but we're just pulling together 3 different fields, putting it in one description, and then using that in our site dashboard to make things more understandable. So similarly, we're doing that with the monitoring form, where we're just taking whether it was an assessment or monitoring, and we're adding the date. And in the referral form, we just want to make it clear that it's a referral and not an activity. So we're preceding everything with referral hyphen, and then we're using whatever the person selected as the referral. How to work with text. So calculate fields support a few different methods that are useful. One is just concat brackets. This allows you to join text and values together into a single cell. So for example, if you do concat first name, and you'll notice I add the space manually by doing in single brackets the space, and then I give the last name, that would put my name, Danny, space Coyle, together in one cell. Similarly, if you wanted to have like if-then logic, you can also implement this. This is a bit more complicated. So if-then logic always works like if something is true, then do this, otherwise do that. So in this case, if the person has selected FGD, then assign echo, otherwise assign FCDO. So you can do things like, rather than asking your user, hey, is this echo or this is or FCDO, if it's the case that FGDs are always assigned to echo and everything else is under FCDO, you could put a calculated field that does a little bit of that logic for the user so that they don't have to. The last option, it's a bit more advanced, but basically you'll notice that when you reference select one or select multiple, it doesn't really give you the label, it gives you the name, right? So in our use case earlier, where we had man, woman, other, was 1, 2, and 3, it's going to give me 1. It's not going to say man, right? And maybe I want it to say man. So if you use JR choice name, it allows you to turn that 1 back into the language the user is currently using in the ODK form. So this again can get a bit complicated, because if you have a form that's in English and French, it will show you like man in English if you're using the English interface. And if you switch to the French interface, it would show you man in French. But yeah, it's useful in moving, away from a name and into the label for the select questions. Lastly, calculate fields are really useful for debugging. Sorry, calculate fields. Let me start over. Calculate fields are also really important for calculate fields, you need to debug them, is what I'm trying to say. So oftentimes, as you see these calculations on the earlier slide, they're a little bit complicated. You can very easily make typos in them. They very often will not appear how you want them to appear. And so that's why we suggest that you debug before you use them. And a really easy way to do this is just by using note. So if you change the type of the question from calculate to note, what it does is it just shows you how that field is calculating, like the result of the calculate, so that you can sort of break down your steps. Like it may be that you have 2 or 3 calculate fields that are allowing you to add up into some, end value. And if that's the case, it's really useful to be able to see like what is happening at each step. Is the math correct? Did you make an error? Yeah, so when you work with calculate fields, just remember you don't always have to like submit something, export the data, then see. If you just put the note as the field type, you can see what's happening while you fill out the form and how the behavior works. Last one, we're not going to talk too much about this, but if you have like really complicated forms or you need to like reference data, you may want to consider using this pull data functionality. What this does is it allows you to connect a CSV file, a comma segregated value file, to use as a reference file. So for example, if you have like a list of locations and you need to know the population for the location, and you want to show that to the user so that they can reference it, you can do that by attaching the population data to the form and then using this pull data approach to pull in the population values. So just some things to note, you shouldn't be doing this for personal data because CSV files are not secure files. So you don't want to be putting like people's names and IDs in a pull data attachment. You should also not do this if the data is going to change a lot. So for example, if the population data is changing every week or every day, it means that you're going to have to update that media file as often as that data change. So it's not really great for really dynamic data sets or data that's changing a lot. But it is really useful for returning specific language values. So if you really like, if you're saying like, hey, the person selected 1, and I always want to return the English word for 1, in our form, which is male or man, it's useful for that. Or it's useful for returning variables. So if you want to have a lookup table where, you want to return the whether or not wash referral should be made in that location, it's going to allow you to do that. Okay, so as I said, I want to give you, like after we've covered those methods, I want to talk to you a little bit about what we mean by working backwards and kind of visualize what that looks like. So for our activity reporting form, I've started with this kind of table structure. And this is the table structure that I think is a good table structure for me to work with when I do my indicator reporting. And let's talk about why that is. So for indicator reporting, I obviously need to know the date of the activity because my donors have specific eligibility dates. I need to be able to tell my boss, what happened in January versus March or between January 15th and March 15th. So date for sure needs to be there. I need to know the activity name. And I also need to know this thing of like achieved. I need to know how many was done. So whether it's an NFI distribution that targets the number of households, or if it's an FGD where we're counting the number of participants, I kind of just need to know like how many were done, right? Like if we're thinking about a log frame, you always have your indicator and then you have your target or your actual achieved value. So that's useful for me to have in one location, just because as you can see, I can filter that table really easily and I can get the sum, so if I put a date filter on and an activity filter, it's pretty easy for me or my boss to pull out the information they need to write the report. I might need some other information, right? Like let's say I want to break down how many activities were done by site or how many users did these activities. So there may be other information there, but really, at bare minimum, I'm going to need this date, the activity name, and the achieved, right? So this is my target. This is what I think is a good structure for me. However, when I start building my form, it quickly becomes the case that I'm not getting that structure, right? I need to record the number of NFI kits distributed, which is like one value, right? Units. But for my FGD type activities, I need to ask how many men, how many women, and how many participants were there. So I've done this calculation that adds together the men and the women to make my total, but that participants field is different than the units field. So already, if we compare to here, I'm not getting the structure I want at the end of the day. Now, obviously, I can do some processing after I export the data, but let's, in keeping with this spirit of pre-processing, how can I amend this form to really get the structure that I want? And so some of the solutions that I've started to think about are, what if I added a calculate field that had a way to pull either the value of participants or units depending on the activity? And sure enough, if I was to add this code to that calculation field or that column, it would say, if the activity is an FGD, give me the value of participants. Otherwise, select the value of units. So in this form, maybe I'm only tracking FGD and NFIs. It's pretty simple. But what this would do is it would give me that achieve field with always the value of either participants or units. And then when I export the data, I would end up with this structure that I showed you earlier. So again, would there be other fields? Yes, but I would still be able to export the data in a way that means that I select only 3 fields and I get the kind of structure that I wanted when I set out. Okay, so you'll see this a lot in the activity form. I'm going to suggest that you review that in detail. I mean, I think it's often the case that we require certain activities to have a breakdown of sex and age disaggregated data and reporting, but other activities don't need that. So for example, in our activity form, we're doing some community engagement activities that require SAD, and then we have some site improvement works where we don't really need to know SAD, but we do need to know like the number of meters of something that was rehabilitated. Or you'll have activities like a site plan where, we're really just counting the number of site plans that were made. It's only ever going to be one per form, right? You're not saying like I made 3 plans for one site. So in this, we can design a form in which even where the form itself is sort of collecting that information differently across different fields, we're still able to pull it into one field. We can call this like a summary field or like a concatenated field that is actually just like, adding or pulling different information from different fields into one so that it's easier for me to work with at the end of the day. Okay, any questions on that?
No questions.
Yeah. So again, today I think we covered a lot of pretty advanced and rapid fire guidance sessions. I know we've gone over, but just to reiterate, one of the reasons I think we work at global level is just so that we have a little bit of luxury and space to explore some of the common problems that we have with ODK at operations level. So if you ever have questions or a problem in your ODK form, again, if you've started your process by saying, hey, here's what I want to work with at the end of the day, if you reach out to us, we'd be more than willing to help you figure out whether we can make that structure deliverable through the form itself so that you don't have to do all this cleaning work or transformation work after your data is collected. That's all we have for today. Again, we'll be providing you the forms as a follow-up to this lesson so that you can review them. Thanks very much.